General Victoriano Huerta had just defeated the Constitutionalists in the north of Mexico. He was now marching south to meet his rival, Pancho Villa, who had been terrorizing his forces from the state of Chihuahua. For months, Huerta's soldiers had fought hard and long for the dictator Porfirio Diaz, who ruled Mexico with an iron fist. But for all their sacrifices, their general would betray them at every turn, leading them into ambushes or ordering them to surrender when they were close to victory. Even worse, he would take credit for their victories, then execute any soldier who disputed his claims. General Victoriano Huerta had become one of the most decorated soldiers in the Mexican army. He wore medals and badges that identified him as a distinguished veteran of the French Intervention, the Mexican Revolution, and the war against the Yaqui Indians. In fact, his uniform was so decorated it was more like a piece of tapestry than military attire. The only thing missing was the silver star awarded to heroes of the nation. And Huerta believed that once he finished off Villa, that decoration would be his. Unfortunately, it was not to be. As we've seen in previous episodes, Pancho Villa was no ordinary bandit. He was the leader of a revolutionary army. And though his soldiers were poorly armed and even more poorly trained, they fought with a passion that made up for any tactical deficiency. By contrast, Huerta's men were veterans who knew how to fight, but they lacked the enthusiasm of their enemies. When the two armies finally met, this made all the difference. In the first battle, Villa's men used their superior numbers to trap Huerta's force and wipe them out. In the second, a civilian uprising in the city of Torreon forced Huerta to retreat with his tail between his legs. By the time he reached the safety of Mexico City, half his men had been lost to enemy fire, disease, or desertion. Those who remained were bitter and disillusioned. They hated their general, blamed him for all their misfortunes, and longed to be rid of him. But by far the worst part of Huerta's Mexican campaign was yet to come. After arriving in the capital, he ordered the execution of all captured Villistas, no matter what rank they held. Then he turned on the civilians, arresting, torturing, and murdering anyone who supported the revolution. To make matters even worse, he completely ignored the fact that Mexico was in the middle of a deadly pandemic. And since he couldn't tell the difference between a constitutionalist and a sick person, he ordered the quarantine zones to be dissolved and their inhabitants murdered. While Huerta's men rampaged through the streets of Mexico City, he slipped away to safety aboard a United States Navy ship, leaving his soldiers to finish cleaning up the mess. It was until the next day that they realized he was gone, and that he left them holding the bag. Now, this betrayal was too much for the Mexican people to stomach. It pushed them over the edge, and transformed the revolution from a civil conflict into a full-blown war of independence. Suddenly, everywhere Huerta went, he was met with hostility. People spat in his face, cursed his name, and did everything they could to avoid serving under him. Of course, this was not what Huerta wanted, but there was nothing he could do about it. He was now persona non grata in Mexico. The man who had once been celebrated as a hero was now being treated like a common criminal. And that's why he welcomed the offer of amnesty from the very government he'd spent his entire life trying to destroy. If you think this story is crazy, wait till you hear what happened next. When Victoriano Huerta agreed to lay down his arms and retire to private life, he must have thought that he had it made. After all, President Venustiano Carranza promised to grant him noble birth, a noble title, noble wealth, and most importantly, noble protection. Sadly, however, this was another case of a Mexican revolutionary promising one thing and doing another. Huerta was arrested and charged with treason. All the while, his former comrades assured him that his trial would be fair and impartial. However, instead of a court of law, Huerta was handed over to a kangaroo court composed of nothing but politicians. And instead of a defense attorney, he was given a former officer who hated his guts. Needless to say, Huerta had no chance. He was summarily convicted, sentenced to 30 years in prison, and thrown into the same cell block as the murderers and rapists he himself had executed without mercy. To make things worse, his fellow inmates hated him for his crimes. They beat him regularly, stole whatever little food he had, and taunted him mercilessly. All the while, Huerta dreamed of escaping to the United States, where he could live out the rest of his days in luxury and comfort. But unfortunately, the other prisoners found out about his plan and punished him severely. First, they beat him bloody. Then they locked him in a cell by himself for 2 weeks, without giving him any food or water. After he was released from solitary confinement, Huerta fell to his knees and begged his jailers for forgiveness. But they just laughed in his face and told him to get to work cleaning the toilets. Eventually, they grew tired of tormenting him and allowed him to return to his old room. But they continued to harass him constantly, making his life in prison as miserable as possible. As the months dragged by, Huerta's health deteriorated rapidly. His vision became cloudy, his mind confused, his body emaciated. At first, the other prisoners taunted him for being a coward, but soon they began to pity him. They brought him extra food and clothing, and even helped him bathe and shave. Finally, on January 6, 1916, they carried his unconscious body to the prison infirmary, where he died 3 days later. It wasn't until February that his fellow inmates learned the cause of death. An autopsy revealed that General Victoriano Huerta had been suffering from a rare form of congenital syphilis that caused blindness and dementia before killing its victim. This, of course, meant that the general had been insane for years, but because he was a high-ranking officer, everyone had ignored it. The news of Huerta's illness spread like wildfire throughout the prison. At first, the other inmates felt sorry for him, but many quickly changed their minds after hearing how he had betrayed them. Some cried out for revenge, but cooler heads prevailed, and they decided that the dead man deserved a decent burial. Still, they were careful to only show respect to his body and not to his memory. They buried him in a shallow grave behind the prison wall without any ceremony, ritual, or religious service. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., President Woodrow Wilson received word that General Huerta was no longer a threat. As you can imagine, he was very pleased. The United States had sent the Mexican army $50 million worth of weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and supplies. And Wilson wanted to see those investments pay off. In fact, he hoped that Huerta's defeat would lead to a political solution to the Mexican conflict. Unfortunately, that's not how things turned out. The Huerta was dead, and Villa was finished. The Mexican Revolution continued for another 4 years. During that time, an estimated 100,000 Mexicans were killed, and the country was pushed to the brink of extinction. Nevertheless, the US government kept pouring money into the project, even as the fighting dragged on. And when the dust finally settled and the victors began dividing up the spoils, American officials were nowhere to be seen. Now, this may seem confusing, but it really makes sense if you understand how American foreign policy works. The US didn't support the Mexican Revolution to help bring about democracy or to protect American business interests. They intervened in Mexico for exactly the same reason they invaded Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, to name just a few. They wanted to exert control over these countries so that their neighbors would unfall into the hands of European powers. However, now that World War I was raging in Europe, the US couldn't spare any troops to occupy Mexico. And so, the Americans simply withdrew from the country and crossed their fingers that the new government would behave itself. Well, that's what they wanted, but that's not what they got. Under the new constitution, Mexico became a full-blown democracy. They elected their leaders, passed laws, held referendums, created political parties, the whole shebang. But the problem was that the Mexicans didn't know how to wield such power. They squabbled and argued among themselves so much that the country descended into chaos. The result was that the US soon regretted their decision to leave. Mexico was once again plunged into civil war, this time between the newly formed government and the states of Yucatan, Sonora, Coahuila, and Nuevo León. Once again, the United States was asked to intervene. Once again, they agreed. This time, however, the Americans didn't send Victoriano Huerta or Pancho Villa to do their dirty work. They sent General John J. Pershing. That's right. The man who led the American Expeditionary Force in World War I was dispatched to pacify Mexico. And since it took him 2 years to find Pancho Villa, you can probably guess how well that went. To learn more about the American occupation of Mexico, click here, okay? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of daring do and daring don't.